I'm Device from Astralis, and welcome to Thorin's YouTube channel. It's a joke-free zone.
Okay, here we go. Come on, lads. Got my little drink. Got my little mate, Skrill Pup. You can sit there. Come on, boys. It's the semi-final. We out here flossing. It's the Danish Kingdom semi-finals. This is what we do. It's your time to shine, boys. Time to have the Age of Astralis, right? Got my bet on at esports pools. Can you believe those idiot fans have bet on SK Gaming to win this series? Fuck Kjaerbye, what the fuck? Can you believe those morons have bet on FaZe to win this game? Come on, they can still do it. Come on. It's getting close. That's okay. It's all right. It's all right. It's cool. It's cool. Glev's got this. I haven't got him in my fantasy team, obviously. I'm not mentally ill. It's okay. I've got Doppe. I've got Dupree in there. He's doing pretty well at the moment. Can you even believe there are people in the world who are actually taking Gambit to win this game? It's a fucking major, baby. Who are the champs, eh? Who are the champs? Why? Come on, Device. Come on. Let's see full death mode. Got you picked in my fantasy team at esports pools. You're going to be the MVP, son. I'm sure of it. I know, Scrilluminati. I know there's a tournament next week, mate. They'll only go out in the fucking semi-finals again, won't they? Yeah, I know. They should win, but they didn't. Yeah. The game's rigged. The game's bullshit. In what has been dubbed the Danish Shuffle, North has benched config, released Cajunb, signed Mertz from their academy, and signed Kjaerbye, formerly of Astralis. Over on Astralis, they've lost Kjaerbye to North, and they've replaced him with Magisk, the former North player, but most recently of Optic, has actually never been on Astralis. Now, as usual, I'm going to break this down team by team, move by move, in terms of should they have removed this player, should they have added this player. Now, I will point out, even though technically within the Danish Shuffle, you could say that Cajunb and Config going to Optic is part of the Danish Shuffle. It's not a Danish team, though. So actually, I'm going to leave that for a separate video. Also, I don't really want to do 3-team breakdown and separate myself from the much-deserved Skrill I will get for that third video from the old Green Wall fans. Now, North benching Config makes no sense from the outside. Like, quite frankly, it still looks to me, when you consider how Valde was benched from Heroic, it still looks to me as if he was actually meant to go to Astralis all along, even though Astralis deny wanting to replace anyone on their team. I mean, certainly when they got Magisk and they made that comment in their post that, like, you know, he was one of many options they were exploring or something, that was kind of a weird comment. That almost implied like he wasn't our first option, and as if they were saying that to allay the fears of fans who were like, what the fuck, you wanted Magisk as your first choice. Now, there is the factor as well that the deadline of the roster change and the fact, presumably, if North wanted to let Config go, it was going to be for a high amount of money. We know Optic's got money. Maybe Astralis didn't want to spend that money. Who can really know in that particular sense? But the idea of North benching him, I don't really understand it all in all. I mean, unless he somehow had attitude problems, I mean, it's possible. He's certainly a very fiery guy. Unless somehow he was just sick of playing in North, also possible. But I do somehow suspect that maybe he thought this was his chance to go to Astralis, and maybe he asked to be benched or said, I want to leave, because he was clearly by far the best player in North. I know at the very end he had a bad couple of tournaments, but over the whole year there was no one in North close to him. He was an amazing player. He was a top 10 player in the world. He had superstar power, certainly a lot of potential still in him as a player, and he'd really gotten his game to a much higher level than we'd ever seen before. Now, in terms of releasing Cajunb, I also think that's a bad move. It's not the right move for this team, because unless this is attitude related, quite frankly, I feel like they've railroaded this guy. They've fucking left him out to dry because they've forced him into being the primary AWPer. I know it may be the case. Maybe for all I know, he wanted to be and he said, I'd do that, etc. The fact that he's immediately gone to Optic and said, I'll be rifling again, shows me that if anything, I don't really know that he did want to. But within MSL's system, which by the way has never really played around a strong solo AWPer, because when he had Nico with the C, that guy was really washed up at that point in time. Pimp did it and it destroyed Pimp's game. MSL himself did it and it wasn't good. Then obviously he had Cajunb come in. come in as a hybrid player from Astralis. In the first few months, it wasn't looking that good, quite frankly, in Dignitas. And so then suddenly Cajunb became the primary AWPer and just did it all the time, which he was pretty good in the early days and eventually degraded to just being average in terms of AWPing. So the problem here is you look at what Cajunb is. He's a good rifler. He's a good veteran player who's been there and done it and seen it. He was a decent to good AWPer, depending on what area you're talking about. His main problem is, at all those periods of time, he was never a top AWPer. He was never someone who really should have been a primary AWPer on a team that hoped to be elite. On a team that's just outside of being elite, yeah, he could be the primary AWPer. Well, what do you know? That's exactly the position he was in. And so, yes, as a primary AWPer, he held the team back. But I don't think he ever should have been forced into being a primary AWPer when he's such a good hybrid player as it is. I do think that he suffered in contrast to the elite AWPers and that they would sometimes feast on him, which then forced him into playing more defensively. He also had a somewhat defensive style in Dignitas and North, contrasted with some of those crazy CT maps in Astralis. But even then, he was never like the crazy peek into people. He was the guy who just held the corner and hit a whole bunch of shots, medium range. I think that he actually did still have pretty good production in 2017, which is why I feel like he's been hung out to dry here. Like, I thought actually for 2017, until they got Valde, he was the second best player on North after Config. So I don't think they did him a real service by cutting him like this. I think they kind of did him dirty a little bit, and MSL asked too much of him and asked more responsibility than he could give, which is the failing of MSL, quite frankly, not necessarily the failure of Cajun. I'll also add, pretty decent player sort of in the clutch and post-plant scenarios, a pretty good player in terms of he tended to turn up in those big series that ended up being losses where they would get upset by other teams. It was other players, Magisk most notably early on, AZ pretty much at all times, MSL obviously a bit of a bot. It was those players who didn't do it. Generally, I thought Config and Cajun were actually the main bright spots they had in those big upsets, those big losses, all those big losses in majors, in semis, in the quarters when they wouldn't go further and they didn't win any of the big tournaments we hoped they would. With that said, he has certainly seen his ceiling, and even if he didn't get to show it in North, you're not going to expect much more from Cajun. So if you need firepower, now personally, I would go ahead and say he wasn't the main problem. I would be cutting AZ right now. I don't really know what AZ's done. With that said, though, this is a concept where, yes, it wasn't actually Cajun's fault now, and I would have just made him a rifler, but you are signing Mertz. That was the first move to replace him. Now, that is the right move overall. Like, Mertz is a player who hasn't really done it on the top level, but has shown a lot at Tier 2 and Tier 3 level. He's someone who, well, more Tier 3, by the way. He's someone who seems to be a good fit for what they wanted from Cajun initially, which is they wanted an AWPer, they want somebody who could be a primary AWPer. That's what Mertz is. It's also a good gambler as much as he's a different type of AWPer. He is really aggressive and seemingly can play very well on his own, but I actually think I'll be very interested to see if MSL can set a system up around him, which admittedly MSL hasn't done before, but to give him his AWP spots and his peaks, because he certainly is much more of a peek into you T-side AWPer, whereas Cajun was more of a hold an angle T-side AWPer, or just play a spot and play the spot from the same sorts of angles, CT AWPer, which made him a bit more predictable. Mertz is a lot more of an aggressive hunting for a dual AWPer and a much more mobile player, not least because he has good no-scopes. I also think this opens up a lot of options for MSL as to what he wants to do now, so we'll have to see. A lot of this is in MSL's hands. I actually think that one thing I like about Mertz's game from watching a bunch of his demos is that while he's a fast and aggressive AWPer, he's not like the lightning fast Henny Guardian style, instantly flick onto the guy, simple style AWPer. He's a guy where he fires quickly, but he doesn't fire as fast as possible. He's measured, and he has good scope control with how he sets the angles of his shots up so they don't have to be crazy flicks. And therefore, he tends to be the guy who waits until he knows it's on the guy before he hits. But because he is quick within that context, he gets a lot of consistent hits, and he can take over games and win you the game by yourself. I also think that in having him, you're not forcing anyone to take the role on who can then lose confidence or feel like they've been railroaded or it's all they can do and they're failing the team. He wants to be the AWPer, and that's a new look for an MSL team in terms of the Dignitas/North era. And as such, it gives them more options. It makes them more dynamic. Finally, he also has a strong deagle. Admittedly, Config had an extremely strong deagle. Now, funnily enough, Mertz joining, just because it's an AWPer for AWPer swap, I actually think Mertz is going to be more filling some of what Config brought to the team. Not in terms of role, but in terms of having the strong deagle, in terms of being very aggressive, in terms of probably being set up to be a star in the team and having a lot of opportunities to take aggressive peaks, I would hope. So I think in that sense that he's going to bring more if he can live up to some of this potential. Now, it is also worth pointing out that while he is, yes, very unproven, it's very rare a team player gets to this level being as unproven as he is, But he is coming from North Academy, so they've had a chance to play with him, possibly see him play, get feedback from his coach there, Ave. And with Ave as a coach, one of the best tactical leaders of all time in Counter-Strike 1.6, hopefully that means it's a good sign and he understands tactics to some degree and his role and what they expect from him. He's not just coming in dry from a lower level team and now having to fit into what in theory will be a quite tactical team, we'd assume, with MSL. Now, in terms of North signing Kjaerbye, this is a good move. This is a fantastic signing for them. Assuming they had no choice but to lose Config, this is about the best they could have hoped for because no one else was going to get kicked from Astralis. He's the best available option, especially being as Magisk is a player they've already had. They couldn't really figure out how to use, and he's really not what they need right now. I actually think that in this team especially, he can be a star player. I think he's actually quite a nice slot in then for what Config did. I think they have quite a lot of similarities because I think actually that Kjaerbye was molded into the AZ role and Config was molded into the Kjaerbye and AZ role, and they all basically, that's how they crafted the stars in the MSL system. So he's back in that system, and I think actually he can be better than he was in Astralis now playing in the MSL system. I actually think that he has less attitude than Config as well, and seemingly appreciates the MSL system. So I think he'll be a little bit more home in that sense. I don't know if he'll be better than Config because Config was pretty good. He has the potential to be, though. I think, not certain it's going to happen though. I also think it shows how the dynamic between the two teams has changed in as much as now you've got a player going from Astralis willingly to North, whereas before it would always be players being stolen from Dignitas to TSM because Dignitas couldn't hold on to them and they wanted to play in TSM, more money, bigger team, better players, and they would always be going in that direction out of choice. I actually think he can show a lot more than he showed in Astralis. He did get a lot of resources in his own way. I think he was set up pretty well because he was often the follow-up man to someone like Glaive or in latter days Dupree sometimes. I think he had his role in Astralis and he was good. The problem is he started to struggle a lot more in the latter half of the year, and especially I will say up until the point they had the roster issues. When Device had his issues and they swapped people around, he actually to some degree regained some form, I thought, but that wasn't real Astralis play, quite frankly. Is he good enough to be the main star of this team? Well, he was in the past on a weaker version of Dignitas, admittedly, but I think he has the skill set to overall, but only if the system's set up around him. Because I think beyond his first bullet aim and some of his post-pants play early for the first 6 to 8 months in Astralis, I think he's a little bit more limited than a lot of star players. With that said, Mertz is going to be this aggro AWPer. Valde, at the moment, from the first few matches in North, is showing some insane form. So maybe he won't have to be a true star in that sense, like a superstar player. Maybe he can just be one of the stars or one of the better players with firepower. And now we can have a good tactical team with very good firepower, somewhat like Astralis to some degree. Now, how does AZ keep his spot in these teams? I don't get it. Like, I realize he's a soldier, probably just does what he needs to, probably got a good relationship with MSL, doesn't backtalk, probably comms pretty well. That can't be enough, though. I don't know how this guy's surviving, and people like Cajunb, people like Magisk are getting cut. Config's now being allowed to leave the team. This seems like a massive oversight in this squad. Now, I'll also add in, if I had to speculate, maybe MSL still has the mindset, I had AZ as a star, no one else made him a star in the way I did, I can rehabilitate him, he's going to be my project, and when I turn him into a good player and our team succeeds, everyone will see that they were wrong and I was right, which is a very dangerous road for any in-game leader or coach to go into. I'd rather just work with players that I have a good sense of what they're going to do and I can give them responsibilities they can actually deliver upon. Now, so overall for North, I would say a slight positive move. You lost by far your best player, but you got a pretty good player who could be as good. You got a player who, at least in terms of what he brings to your team in Mertz, probably brings more than the old guy, since you didn't give the old guy really his kind of spots and his chance, and maybe his confidence was shot. Now, in terms of Astralis, this is a much less positive move because they lost Kjaerbye. Okay, here's the thing. That was the right player to remove, but for the wrong reasons. It was the right player because, first of all, his form dropped off heavily over the last half of the year. On CT sides especially, he got a lot weaker. When you consider Astralis' T-side form continued for like the whole 3/4 of 2017, he was one of the reasons why from the summer onwards they had a lot of issues because his CT play fell apart completely. Think about maps he's playing. Inferno, Mirage. These were maps he started to struggle on CT side. On Mirage at Connector, he was just getting exploited all day by the really strong entry fraggers in the game. People like Fur just tore that ass up. Then you look on Inferno. Okay, he played a pretty tough spot, admittedly, but I don't really think it suited his. I think he played around like the pit / the quad area. I don't think that quite frankly, really suited him at all, actually. This is a guy where you don't want him spraying. His strength isn't spraying, it's first bullet aim. I want him more like the guy peeking into the banana, or I want him as the guy peeking on the right side of mid and then just combing and pulling back and then taking initial shots and repositioning. I felt like they misused him there, but then again, maybe other people were in good roles and that was just all that was left over for him. So those were Astralis' problem maps from sort of like summer onwards, Mirage and Inferno, where they lost a lot of their big games to the top teams, and I think he was one of the reasons why, quite frankly. I will say, in a sense, they fucked him because they didn't play very much train and emphasize that map much, and that was one of his best maps on CT side, and that's a map where actually he looked pretty at home on T side and CT side, so they didn't necessarily emphasize his strengths in that sense. I also think if you look at his CT problems, you could actually kind of see over the year, as Dupree's play came back online in form and Zipnik's got better, I think actually you start to see them swapping people like Zipnik's into some of his spots, giving Kjaerbye less of the T-side pure aggression and putting Dupree there to combo with him. And you kind of saw them do like double face moves to somewhat hide Kjaerbye and his problems a little bit, or reduce the negative impact that he was having on the game from things he couldn't necessarily do. I think MSL could probably learn something from this. Now, I will say, in the early days, he was a pretty good post player, especially because he would be aggressive off it, knowing that he had all these players who could be very stable and play by the numbers. And so in some senses, he got to be a wildcard player on both sides of the game. Part of his problem was, even though his decision-making looked good, I always thought he was a bit flawed in that he wasn't a very patient player. Now, you can use that. You want him as your entry fragger like you do. You want him to be the aggressive guy after post plants. That works. But in other scenarios, you would see if he got exploited as CT, he didn't necessarily look that patient, or he didn't know how to com properly and then have a different setup. Sometimes he'd just play the setup the same way. Sometimes he'd aggro push out and try and gamble and sort of win the game back. Now, with his insane first bullet aim and his initial bursts, yeah, he can do that. He can take over a game. But he didn't do it nearly as often as he seemingly thought he would by his actual aggressiveness in the game and an attempt to play the game. He had a pretty good deagle. I think he's always had, by the way, pretty nuts first bullet aim, so he was very suited as an entry fragger. My problem is, I always thought he played way too much off angles and aim, and if he'd have actually played as in peak angles, and if he'd have actually played a little bit smarter, like if he'd have had like Magisk's understanding of how to hold an angle, but then with his nutty first bullet aim, I think he could have accomplished a lot more without having to just go head to head with some of the best crazy entry players in the world or best CT spot holders in the world. I think that was a flaw he had, a little bit of hubris on his part, maybe because he's so young, thinking he could be an even better player than he was, and his spray definitely wasn't. You've seen all that stupid shit where he's just spinning it around like that. His spray wasn't even close to good enough. He was so exceptionally good in other areas, it made up for it. But I can see why, if you had to remove a player, this would be the one. Now, obviously, they didn't remove him out of choice. He left, but it was the right player to leave. I wanted them to upgrade him for config for a long time. Sadly, that's why it was the wrong reasons, because he left them without the ability to upgrade to config unless seemingly they were willing to pay a lot of money at the last minute, when that should have been the obvious move for Astralis to get the upgrade, go into a new era, make it the device and config show. Now you've got a pretty well-stacked team. Now that's a team that can win majors, can win massive tournaments, because config, what is he? He's an aggro entry player with 6 skills. He's another star-level talent, actually a superstar level talent in a way that Kjaerbye probably wasn't. He's someone who brings balls and confidence to a team that at times suffered from it. Not overall, they were so smart as a team they could always get into close games, but they did seem to suffer a little bit when it came to having the player who really has the confidence to think he's the best player in the world. They didn't have many of them in that team. Admittedly, Kjaerbye did a decent enough job. Now, in terms of signing Magisk, I think this is kind of a sideways move. He's a very different player, but I think there was better options. One is getting config. Another one is they could have gotten Juggy from, or Yuggy or whatever they call him, from Heroic. Maybe they couldn't. I mean, Heroic is another team owned by Refresh, so I'm amazed that move didn't happen. Remember, primary AWPer, somewhat aggressive AWPer, played under a tactical in-game leader. That should be a surefire kind of lock-in move. They didn't go for it, though. Not sure why. They also, by the way, I thought a real option should have been thinking about bringing Cajunb back. I know they might buy into the story. Hey, he's not as good now. We've beaten North a lot of times. I think that would have been a good move. He's a hybrid player. He's got a nice skill set. Therefore, he could take some of the AWP pressure off Device. You could even then have used 3 players. You could use Device, Dupree, and Cajun as AWP threats, depending on the map and on the side, kind of like they used to when they had Device, Cajun, and Carrigan back in the old TSM/Astralis. I also think he's played under a different in-game leader, but I actually think he could have played under Glaive's system. He actually Obviously, he shined most in Carrigan's system, but he definitely, at least for the first part, had a decent time in MSL's system. I think if Glaive was willing to give him a little bit more freedom, he could have done a lot more if he'd have joined. And admittedly, okay, the device Dupree Cajun trio wasn't that strong like in majors and massive finals, sure, but I do think he had fairly good chemistry with them overall. Now, admittedly, in terms of Magisk, he is something of a troubled player. You have to say that at the outset. Now, yes, he was the best player in Optic, but that didn't say much. Optic wasn't a very good team. They were quite underwhelming considering the names they had, actually. He didn't blast everyone and become some star player, do a simple or a config like I hoped he would when he was playing for a worse team. He was consistent still, and he's always been fairly consistent in terms of the spots he plays, how he plays them, how his aim goes. But his star power, his star level, his fragging power has sort of dropped off fairly gradually, but over the last couple of years, it's noticeable, quite frankly, compared to those first 4 to 5 months when he joined Dignitas, and he looked absolutely phenomenal. He does seem to fit the role that they'll probably want for him in Astralis better, because I'm assuming now Dupree is just full-time entry again. He's going to be back to that. His confidence seems back, and it's Dupree and Glaive playing the entry game, and then you put Magisk as sort of a semi-lurk, so something like what he was doing back in Dignitas, and Device generally remaining as the AWPer. I actually think Glaive might be the player to solve this riddle and figure out how to get him back to something close to his form before, even though MSL kind of let him degrade and then swapped his positions as almost a punishment or because he just couldn't do them anymore. Skill-wise, he is totally different to Kjaerbye. Kjaerbye, amazing first bullet aim, aggressive angles, not that good spray, not that good in terms of repeaks, etc. Goes too much off aim. Magisk, much more the Cold Zero type guy. I actually thought late 2016 he was going to become the Danish Cold Zero, as the guy who played the angles well, likes a slow game, likes to reset and take fights one by one. Fantastic spray, therefore he doesn't have to take crazy headshot angles and peek into people and juke around a lot. He just wrecks you with his slightly moving spray very fantastic player in that sense. Also, I think a good thing when he comes into Astralis is he doesn't have to be the main star now. I think that's a better spot for him than where he was in North, where they were relying on him and Config to be the main stars because Cajun was stuck in a role that didn't fit him as much. He's also, by the way, as a side point, Kjaerbye actually was a pretty decent player on Overpass and actually played pretty much the same CT spots that Magisk does. So that's a very good sign. Overpass always been Magisk's best map. And obviously, it was the best map for a long time in Astralis, and they want it to be their best map, and he can potentially in Magisk bring that back to being your best map, and so that's very interesting. Although I want to see how he interacts with Device, who plays long A, and he plays more towards the party / upper bathrooms area of A. I do think that a problem with Astralis now that I want to look for is I feel like now they're going to lack kind of a spark plug player, more of a wild card, someone who can be very aggressive, because that's not Magisk's game at all. So I feel like that's going to put that pressure onto Dupree, because aside from Dupree, who is there? Device will take angles for AWP shots. Okay, somewhat aggressive, still not the most aggressive AWPer. Then you've got Dupree, has played an entry role, been fantastic at that for years, hasn't done it for a while as much until the latter part. With Kjaerbye, we started sharing that responsibility. Xyp9x obviously is a supportive player. He's going to be a post-plant player. Magisk is more of a semi-lurk player. He's not going to want to go aggressively. Glaive has to pretty much be almost a pure entry at this point, working with Dupree. So I feel like that's where they might be a little bit lacking, is very aggressive play, but that was never really the Astralis style. So I thought that, yes, Kjaerbye's wildness gave them a factor there. It also had its punishments, though, on the CT side, where I think actually Magisk will be a much better player. So I feel like he can add a lot on that kind of a setting. And I think Magisk is just a lot more stable and plays set spots better. So he's going to play into the mentality of the Xyp9x's and the Devices of the world who want that very stable game. You play angles smartly, you come with each other, use utility, and then you just sit back and you spray them when they come in the sight. So I could see them becoming better at Astralis' strengths, but having a little bit less diversity, a little bit less options overall, whereas actually North gained options with their moves. I won't address the Optic moves at this point in time. I'll do that in a separate video since Cajun and Config went there. But overall, kind of weird, because in some senses kind of sideways moves. For North, I like it in as much as they've got more options that they can do something with if you're MSL. I could see it making Astralis a stronger version of themselves, but I can't see how they can break out the mold and do much more. So they're going to have to be the best version of Astralis, and then, yes, they can make finals, yes, they can probably win titles again, but some of it's going to now rely probably on individual form of people like Device and Dupree, quite frankly. This video was supported by Dean Tanglis, Michael Allaire, Andreas Westerlund, Alex Adams, Gman, Twch, Jerky's Minion, Anthony, TGreb, Jake Petrucci, Yordan Tsenkov, Daniel Yordanov. Want to get exclusive teasers for my upcoming work? Submit questions for me or make suggestions for my content? Become a part of the ever-growing Scrilluminati via Patreon link in the description box below.